Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast.
But all of those experiences influenced my thinking and made me appreciate the significance of many actors in the lives of children. We shouldn't paint all the people in the same family system as problematic just because some members have been problematic under certain conditions in a certain period. That's really what we can say. How do we connect young people into resources and opportunities outside in the wider world that give them the opportunity to apply some of the learning and the principles or values or norms that we're hoping to instill, but gives them a chance to apply them and test them in the real world and to make connections. We really, I think, need to be thinking about not just one good adult, but trying to find connections for people to many good adults. But being cared about is more important than being cared for in many ways, I think, in the eyes of many of the young people. I think a lot of things are tolerable if you have more certainty. Being kept in the loop helps lower uncertainty. If we stay in touch with their perspective and know what their concerns are and their thinking is, and we check that out all the time. I know we know that, but in a way we need to be kept reminded of that because it's difficult to apply it in daily practice given all the other pressures. But if we can get that right, I think a lot of other good things flow from that. We need to be careful that just because we've heard certain things from some people that holds true across the board. So that's why if we can find a way of working where we're listening to every child, not just episodically a few children, then I think we're going to get more right more of the time. If they feel people are making an honest effort and they're being respectful and that they are being listened to, that itself is very therapeutic. I think they feel, okay, I'm being seen here.
Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and joining me for this episode is a highly respected and influential academic in the subject areas of children in care, care leavers, and marginalised young people. Before I begin the podcast interview, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I come to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture, and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My guest this episode is Emeritus Professor Robbie Gilligan. Robbie holds Professor Emeritus appointment at the School of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity College Dublin. He previously served as Professor of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity from 2001 to 2022, and in total was a full-time academic there for 40 years. He has worked in the area of children in care, care leavers, and marginalised young people in many roles over his career, including as youth worker, social worker, policy advocate, foster carer, board member of residential and community services, advisor, social work educator, and researcher. He's published widely in relation to the experiences of children and young people in out-of-home care and care-experienced adults, with a strong focus on their work and education journeys. He has recently published with Vietnamese colleagues a study of care leaver experiences in Vietnam. He is currently co-principal investigator of 10 Years On, a national study of care leavers in their late 20s, early 30s in Ireland. He also served as an advisor between 2021 and 2022 to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development report on care leavers, the first such intervention by the OECD on this topic. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Colby. Great to be with you.
Great to have you. And I jinxed myself. I said to you if I made any errors when I was writing the bio that I could edit them out. But I didn't even get past the first couple of sentences and I had to redo it. So anyway, uh, modern technology will allow me to make that all sound very polished. Or not. I'll leave this bit in probably. So, as I said, it's just been a remarkable career, Robbie, and with a really long-term focus on care systems and our children and young people who are engaged with those care systems. I wonder if you might just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this line of work.
Um, Well, I often say, and I think in some way, I mean, obviously we have multiple and sometimes hidden motivations that we're not even aware of ourselves, I suppose. But the kind of overt point that I can recall is a Latin class. I know that sounds like an unlikely source of inspiration, but there was this very quiet, but in many ways quite impressive. Um, he now I now realize he was younger than I thought. He seemed
Yeah,
quite old when I was a teenager, but he
as we
was a
all
Latin
do.
teacher. Yeah, exactly. He was a Latin teacher, but he was also chaplain to a youth club that was run by the past students of the school I went to. I went to a
Mm,
Jesuit college in the centre of Dublin, um, and he was a Jesuit priest. Anyway, a number of us went down to the club and played table tennis or billiards or whatever. And I eventually was one of the ones who stayed on for longer and got drawn into a fairly regular commitment and then went on summer camps and so on. And I remember in the first summer, I think I went for 2 block weeks of camp, and it was kind of one of the highlights of my life up to that
mm,
point. It was just very intoxicating, the fun and the energy and so on. And I remember thinking, actually, this is what I want to do in my life. And now I was still very young at that stage. I was probably 17 or something like that. But it did. I can remember that moment thinking it. I had a kind of a quiet moment, and thinking that at the time during the camp, and that did influence my choice of course. Afterwards, I went and did a social science type course in Trinity, thinking that would be good investment towards probably a further training. Anyway, I ended up as a social worker, and well, actually, went on to do some other kinds of youth work as well as that. So actually, that youth work experience, I would say, was very influential in my thinking about how to work with young people. Anyway, when then did various other placements as you do, and was influenced by those, and then became a social worker in children's services or emerging children's services in Ireland. Worked in a rural community and the centre city of Dublin, which is a more harsh social environment for kids to
mm.
grow up in. Um, but all of those experiences influenced my thinking and made me appreciate the significance of many actors in the lives of children, and that there are many ways that children benefit or are harmed by influences at play in their life. And sometimes the professional gaze is too narrowly focused on the gaze itself
Mm.
and on the single actor of the child or the single household in which the child lives or the single residential unit or whatever. There's kind of sometimes a very inward looking gaze, which
Hmm.
I think misses some of the actual influences that are active or the potential influences that could be activated.
There's a number of things that we have in common. I similarly was involved in youth work and well, more youth ministry for the Church of England, which is the Anglican Church here in Australia, and probably it was undoubtedly it was my experiences in that forum that did result in me ending up being a psychologist who specialised in working with children and young people. Um, and there were many people, I guess, who contributed significantly to that. And I'd have to say that it was adults outside of the family, so outside of the immediate family, that did make an impression on me, and yeah, and kind of set me in the path that I've taken. So there is a bit of similarity there, and I think obviously the Latin teacher, the Jesuit priest, was someone of uh, who made a significant impression on you at that time.
Yeah, but if I may jump in there, no, he was, but I would say very much agree with you that many of the people who I would say have been big influences in my life are not from within my family. That's not to say my
Mm,
parents weren't important. I'm an only child. That's another big sort of, I suppose, dynamic in my life. So I didn't have siblings or their friends to be connected into. But I didn't know the priest. Some of the boys got on, had close connections with the priests because they were involved in out of school activities. And I mean, in a sense, I was involved in
mm,
that, became involved in that club. But I wasn't that close to this man. But I mean, I think it's an interesting point. But he still had quite an influence because
mm,
we connected at a particular moment, um, and he opened an opportunity for me which fitted. Many of the boys didn't stay on; they drifted
mm,
away. A few of us did stay and get involved, and in various ways it became an influence in our lives, career choices and other things. So, but the point is, he didn't have to have a deep personal relationship for him to have some important influence because we trusted him. We accepted his bona fides. There was something very authentic and genuine about him. Um,
mm,
but all he was asking us was to go and visit the club and see what we thought, and it was up to us then. He wasn't in any way applying any pressure. It was very much our agency as these young teenage boys to decide. There wasn't any pressure, any suggestion that there'd be rewards of some sort if we did this. It was
mm,
totally an open offer. And I agree. I mean, I met friends in the youth club, other adults, young adults, a few years older than me, who became one of them, particularly Fergus McCabe, unfortunately deceased recently, but he
mm,
became a close friend and influential figure in my thinking right through my life.
mm,
Really quite an impressive figure. Now, that's a different kind of relationship, but again, sparked by the chance offer and connection. I mean, as I often say to have said to students, if I wasn't in class that day,
mm.
I mightn't be
Yeah.
sitting here talking to you. So it's
Mm,
possible I would have found my way into social work by some other route.
mm,
I've no doubt that that's possible, but
mm,
it is still an interesting example of how random opportunities
mm.
present themselves,
Yeah.
but often through people you trust.
Mm, mm.
And I think that's a pretty important ingredient.
It's interesting because I've had other guests on the podcast who say something similar, that there were these significant adults in their life that had, or these, sorry, they were adults who had a significant impact on their life direction. And, in child protection and out of home care, a lot of emphasis is put on, as you say, on attachment relationships and those close dependency relationships that develop within families and are seen to exert the greatest influence on the trajectory of the growth and development and indeed the life course of the young person. But the guests who've spoken to me about, who this there was this influential adult, um, they may have had only fleeting contact with that person. They're not an attachment figure, in any sense, that we would normally define such a person. And yet, when they look back, they go, well, there was this teacher often enough, or this therapist that they may have only had brief and fleeting contact with, but they said something that was a seed. They planted a seed.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I say I wasn't close to him, I wasn't. I mean,
Mm,
we'd have had relatively few one-to-one conversations as I think about it, but I was in his presence in a classroom for maybe two, possibly 3 years.
mm,
Uh, Certainly 2 years, I think. And that is like sitting in a classroom being taught Latin, which was my favorite subject,
mm,
and maybe partly because of the way he taught it and so on. But it was my favorite subject. So that was a big advantage, I think, that
mm.
we were sharing something we both enjoyed and liked.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so,
There was an
but there
affinity there.
was. Yes, yes, I think that's an important element. And I think also it wasn't, I agree with you. I think there are times when fleeting things happen and they actually have quite a big influence. You sit beside
Mm,
somebody a long haul flight for 3 or 4 hours, you end up chatting at length and discovering shared interests, and they give you a suggestion of something to do and so on.
mm,
And it proves to
mm,
be very formative, experience afterwards. So, in that sense, it's not the contact with the priest wasn't fleeting, but it was
mm,
relatively shallow in some
mm,
respects. But in other respects, there was a depth there. And obviously, he was very much immersed in the Jesuit culture and the school culture and all of that.
mm.
And he was also very respectful. He was very gently spoken. He was very understated. And he was the kind of guy that you'd almost feel sorry for him coming into the room, because you'd feel that he was going to be, sort of overwhelmed by
Mm,
these these teenagers who needed somebody with a very strong will to keep them in check.
mm.
But he somehow was able to, he had a different form of influence or authority. I think that made an impression on all of us as well. He'd come from Hong Kong, so he was always had that slightly Asian or Chinese, gentleness about him
Mm.
made,
Yeah.
it was a bit exotic for us simple boys.
Mm, mm, mm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I didn't I wasn't wanting to labour the point, but it's interesting to me that the number of children I see who for therapy in therapy who want to be psychologists, and some have gone on to university and haven't yet. Don't yet have a psychologist amongst the ranks of the young people that I've known over the years, but it's that children see something in adults from time to time, and they that affinity, as I mentioned, and and there's that then that I guess um, that desire to emulate in some ways. That again, as I said, it just seems to reinforce that the impact that adults can have on the lives of the children, including adults outside of the family and the network of
yeah,
attachment relationships as such.
yeah, and I would say that. Bit of a generalization, but I think that in general, in the child protection and welfare system, we don't respect enough the power of schools in the
Mm,
lives of children. That if we took a child-led view of their world, school looms very large in their life.
mm, mm,
And people like Michael Rudder would say that for, the great British psychiatrist and psychologist
yeah.
and researcher, um, he was not alone in saying this, but he drew attention to the evidence on this, that
Mm,
for young people with family difficulties, school was the
yeah.
most important positive resource available
Mm,
to them. Often could have a decisive influence on what actually happened as a result of the family difficulties. Now, obviously schools can't do everything, or sometimes we expect too much from them. But at the same time, I think the educational, but also the social resources and supports the schools can bring, even when they're not trying,
mm, Yep.
just just by the structures and the routines and the processes and the informal life.
Mm,
All of these things are happening organically within the system. Now, you
mm,
can also say yes, but schools are also sites where bullying occurs, where things go on under the radar of the adults, which is undoubtedly true. There's a whole world, child world underneath the radar of or gaze of the
mm,
adults, which adults are probably a bit naive about. But some of that, what goes on is positive. It's not all negative. But
mm,
anyway, the point is, I think we need to pay much more attention to the life, the social and inner life of school in the lives of the kids that we're working with.
yeah.
But school is only one example. There's also, faith communities. There's
Hmm.
extended family. We might say, oh, this family, has X, Y, Z problems, but again, I think we should avoid generalizations and see, but actually, yes, but that may be true, but two opposite things can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
There may also be people in the family who are, doing well,
Mm,
um, and who are interested and open to being supportive, an aunt or granny, somebody. I mean, I think that just is
mm,
so important to kind of acknowledge and recognize. We shouldn't paint all the people in the same family system as
mm,
problematic just because some members have been
mm,
problematic under certain conditions in a
mm,
certain period. That's really what we
mm,
can say. But there are others who maybe have a lot to offer,
mm,
and it's important that we don't lose sight of that.
mm,
And similarly, sports clubs, the care and love of animals, all of these sort of foci or focuses, if you like, to present opportunities for young people to connect to adults who may be positive actors in different ways.
yeah. Yeah.
And some of those connections may endure. I think
Mm,
that's the challenge when we're talking about attachment theory. But we're probably over, well, there's a risk that we overvalue one theory at the expense of other valuable theories, like
mhm,
social capital, for example.
mm,
So the social capital would, or the Bronfenbrenner's ecological thinking, these would draw our attention more to systems thinking, to multiple actors, to the potential contribution of different actors, like a Latin teacher. How does a Latin teacher have influence on somebody's social work career? It's not very obvious, but but it's a great example of how
mm,
those kind of quirky things uh,
mm.
do actually spark opportunities for people.
And you're not the first person to talk about these things on the podcast. And I think I'm reminded of podcast guests who've really talked about the importance of the power of the group. And they've talked about that, I guess, a number of podcast guests, particularly in a residential care context, but the important regulating influence that groups have over development and behaviour and outcomes in those areas. Um, Richard Rowlandson, who has had a lifetime of connection to the Mulberry Bush, which was the Mulberry Bush School, which was the Dr. Drysdale's established back in the 1940s and is still going. Now, when I had Richard on, he talked about how the importance of the Mulberry Bush School and residential, it's a residential community, was that it allowed children the opportunity to learn to live with themselves and with other people, which I thought was and then Laura Steckley was another person who really talked a lot about the power of the group and and how the group and relationships within the group can be a force for good, um, in the lives of
Sure,
our children and young
sure.
people. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think one of the points I would tend to emphasize with any audience that gives me even fleeting attention is that there are multiple influences and multiple actors, and the group in the family group in foster care, the group in residential care, and in other settings, the groups, the different groups within the school community and so on. All of those are potentially very influential. But I would also say, in the case of young people in care, in foster care, I think in foster care this happens more organically, that they are connected into community networks because the foster family is living its life in connection with other people, and they get drawn into those connections. But in residential care, I think there's a need for a focus on the group and on the inner world of the setting. But I think there is perhaps at times a loss in that if you don't also have a similar engagement, an outward gaze, an outward connection, an outward facing approach. That's not to say you ignore the inward. You can do both at the same time. We can do opposite things. We can value opposite things. Both serve the same purpose of promoting, I would say, the development of the young person. One of the things I think in residential care that we have to think about is not just improving things for the person while they're there under the influence of the setting. As a very wise volunteer youth worker said to me a long time, one of the first lessons of working with young people, he said, the trick isn't to get kids to do what you want them to do when you're right there with them. The trick is to get them to do things you want them to do when you're not there. And I think one of the things is that there is a world out there that where if we want our influence to endure, we have to have the ideas and issues tested in the real world while they're with us. And they have to be connected into resources that will endure in their lives. I've one example that I've developed in recent times, which I really find works well and I like a lot. The Irish rock star Sinead O'Connor, who died in sad circumstances, but nevertheless had a very interesting career, and there's a lot to be learned from her, even though she was she had her dotty moments, but she was also supremely talented. And she had it mightn't surprise you to know this, but she had a troubled period in her teenage years. And actually, the year before she died, she wrote a short biography, and this is what inspired me to develop this point. She wrote she was kind of anti-institutional, anti-authority, right? Proudly and consistently, and not subtly. And one of the targets of her well, I suppose ambivalence is probably more accurate, because she did like the symbols of religion in different ways, but she would rebel against other symbols. But anyway, she acknowledged that when she was in care, but she was, there was a particular one of the places in Ireland, at that time, not now so much, but at that time, there would have been religious run institutions, and she was placed in one of these. But there was a young nun who was kind of closer in outlook and kind of got Sinead. And she could see that Sinead had a musical talent, and she bought Sinead her first guitar. She arranged her first music classes. And the music teacher was getting married, and Sinead had her first public performance, singing at the wedding of the music teacher. This nun also arranged for her to go or allowed her, or sort of smuggled her out, or whatever way. Anyway, it happened that she went to concerts in the city and kind of got into the music scene. And she very warmly acknowledged that influence in her life. And it was clearly quite transformative, because you could have had, now I think her talent would have found an outlet eventually, but definitely the nun, with her outward facing practice and her kind of ability to find a point of connection with the interests and talents of this young girl, is kind of I think tells us a lot about the value of having this kind of, because she was giving this girl a pathway forward.
Mm.
She was giving her a sense of belonging in the world of music. She was building up her confidence. Recognition theory would say that she was giving her recognition in bucketfuls, but not
Mm.
only her giving the recognition, but creating conditions in which others would give her recognition. That's the significant point,
Mm.
that he was connecting her into resources.
Mm.
Um, I've written about this in a recent chapter, but another storyline in the same chapter is about Paul McGrath, who was I don't know how big an impression he made in Australia, but he was a favourite footballer of his day at Manchester United, Aston Villa, but chiefly for Irish people. He played for Ireland and rescued us in many hairy moments.
Mm.
Irish soccer fans are kind of a breed of people who are familiar with suffering. A lot of sports fans.
Yes. Well, I mean, you did have the Manchester United captain for quite a while
Yeah.
and very
Yes. Yes. Yes.
successful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, Paul McGrath grew up in Kerr, a black boy in a very white, at that time, very white Dublin, um, and still shy. But then I think even as an adult now in his probably 60s, he's, I think, would admit to being a bit shy. But he certainly was, I'd say, then. But he
Mm.
was an extremely talented footballer, and one of the workers in the home was very sort of an amateur football fanatic. Well,
Mm.
more than a fanatic. So he ran teams and was very involved and he could see the boy had great talent, and he put a lot of energy into connecting him into all the football networks in the city, and this eventually led on to his being ultimately a professional in Man United and a greatly admired sportsman of his time. But again, it was that bringing him, okay, he got on well inside the home, but it was outward facing practice. Now, not everyone has those talents, but
Mm.
another example I use in that chapter is about from Portugal of a boy who got a work experience opportunity from a residential unit, from his school, not from the residential unit. He
Mm.
wasn't getting on well at the time in the residential unit. I think that's an important detail, actually. But anyway, he had to get the early morning bus to the bakery. Bakers start work early
Mm.
at hours that we're only turning over in our beds. They're up and about with their ovens and all of that. He got on, this was a small bakery run by the owner. He got on very well there. He was encouraged, to stay on after the work experience and go back and do some part-time work. This was a very, very important relationship he had with this baker. First time maybe in his life that he had an adult who was to some extent a champion for him in a modest way.
Mm.
It was a very important alternative to what was happening inside the home. The home, I don't think, had any active role in facilitating it other than not obstructing it,
Mm. Mm.
which, is not a small matter either. They could have made it difficult in some respect because sometimes they kind of, maybe not so much now, but certainly institutions sometimes create barriers or
Mm.
norms that make it difficult for some of these opportunities to be realized.
Mm.
Uh, but again, I think it's how do we connect young people into resources and opportunities in the wider world that give them the opportunity to apply some of the learning and the principles or values or norms that we're hoping to instill, but gives them a
Mm.
chance to apply them and test them in the real world and to make connections.
Mm.
So, that baker is potentially, I wouldn't say it's overstating it to be that he might be invited to this young man's wedding,
Mm.
that he might be somebody who's a mentor to him in his parenting in the future, not to jump too far ahead. And maybe none of that actually eventuated. But the point is, these are possibilities.
Mm.
That it's opening opportunities. We really, I think, need to be thinking about not just one good adult,
Mm.
but trying to find connections for people to many good adults,
Mm.
and really to a network for life, which may be composed of former carers, positive actors in the birth family network, maybe work colleagues or former work colleagues, done some research on young people's entry into from care into work, and like not just after 18, but before
Mm,
18. Voluntary work, summer work, whatever it was, delivering the newspapers or any of these things, some of which, of course, are kind of going out of fashion, I think. But anyway,
mm,
the point is that sometimes in their stories, these young people said, "Look, I made friends with the boss. He did lots of things for me in my life afterwards."
mm. Yeah.
Um, you know, you could spend a lot of time trying to find a connection. Many people do make a connection with.
Mm,
My impression is that in a journey in foster care, in the American sense of alternative care, there may be one carer that you make a special
mm,
connection with along the journey. But for some of the young people who find it hard to make those connections, finding an employer or a colleague in a workplace who turns into a lifetime friend is a
mm.
big win. Because actually, or building friendships is not a simple matter. Sure, it's not. And they tend to happen very often in the younger life. And if you haven't
Mm,
made the friendships, where do we make them in school very often sometimes. But young people in care moved around the schools, so often
mm,
the friendships are disrupted by care. Well, it's kind of an irony, isn't it? We step in to
mm,
make life better, and we
mm.
actually maybe disrupt some of the good things that are there already.
Yeah. It's there's a lot in there, Robbie, but I think the really powerful message that I'm taking from what you're saying is that perhaps sometimes we spend too much time on the developing of the relationships with the people who are caring for the children at this point in time. Um, and what we need to be also turning our mind to, because we have a saying here in Australia, it probably comes from Ireland, given the number of Irish that came here, that you've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Um, but the powerful message that I'm hearing and what you're saying is that we need to have an eye to their future and to developing pathway or supporting, recognizing and supporting and encouraging pathways to a future, which is a really poignant issue because there's a lot of concern about what happens to young people in care when they turn 18, and a lot of dissatisfaction around the observation that they're really, the statutory organisation pulls back or pulls out, and the children, often our children, are left to really flounder at that point in time. And were we to be more balanced in terms of our efforts prior to them turning 18, insofar as not only you need to get along with the people you live with, but you also need to get along in the world, and you need to make those real connections that facilitate that. And
Yeah,
it was also of interest to me when you were talking that the examples you gave were of care leavers, of people, Sinead and others, um, and I know that's been an interest of yours and a topic of research study across your career, including quite recently. And I'm wondering about what 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 can we learn from our care leavers about how we should deliver a child safety and out of home care system over and above what we've already talked about.
um, yeah. Well, I think probably one of the most important things we can do is listen to their accounts of their experience. I think that is a way of keeping us honest as service developers or service providers, or professionals or carers. So I think listening carefully to what they're saying about their experience, and also I think listening to people when we get evidence about care leaver experience, there's maybe a tendency to listen to people who are in the midst of transition at the age of 18, 19, 20,
Mm,
21, which is a challenging time in anyone's life, not just care leavers, I think.
mm,
But sometimes you get a more considered and more rounded view of the whole process of growing up in care and transitioning out of care into independent or more independent adult life.
mm,
You get a more considered view when people are a bit older. So I think we need to listen to people of all ages inside the care system in the
mm,
transition period after leaving care, and when they've had a bit of time to reflect, and maybe when they've begun to have children of their own and so on. I think there's
mm,
different life stages when different issues resonate or are more significant for people.
mm,
Um, I think the issues that are, seem to be significant for young people in care, listening to care leavers, are things like the stigma of being in care, the
yeah.
difficulty they have in deciding whether to tell people about being in care. That's very telling, I
Mm,
think. Um, the challenges about sense of belonging.
mhm,
Um, do I matter? Do the people I'm with really care for me?
mhm,
Uh, being cared about is more important than being cared for in many ways, I think, in
mm,
the eyes of many of the young people. Um, the significance of school experience and attainment,
mm,
uh, the significance of being able to continue interests in hobbies or, um, very often placement means, I've examples of somebody who was a very good swimmer who was placed a long way from any swimming pools and couldn't maintain that interest. Somebody was a ballet dancer, and that interest got completely lost in placements.
mm,
It was only rediscovered when she got developed a very strong bond with her foster mother, and they were rummaging through old photographs, family photographs, on the couch one evening, and in one of those kind of nice sort of warm moments. And suddenly there's a photograph of the foster mother in a tutu, and that sparked a whole discussion of, oh, I didn't know that, and oh, you were, and yeah, and
mm,
it kind of reopened the possibility that the young person could maybe re-engage with that. So I think the problem with the professional gaze is that we very, very procedural view of the needs and the interests and
mm,
the hopes and so on of the young people, and that we don't start with a
mm,
person-centered view. I've just published a paper recently where we're talking about children's views of participation in child protection as slightly off the point of the care
mm,
leavers, but it's relevant. Um, and one of the things we did a study of young people's experience of being in the child protection system, of being the focus of attention. And that was interesting in lots of ways. But one of the things, when you really sort of thought more about what they were saying, there were two things they really wanted. One was to be kept in the loop.
mhm,
So we were writing about participation in this paper, but the two themes were one, being kept in the loop and not losing face.
mm,
Not losing face meant not losing face, especially among their peers or in their local community, because they were the subject of child protection concerns.
mm,
So, I mean, the system wants to protect the children, which is, of course, important, and the kids don't dispute that they were right to be there, but they had concerns about how this was done. So
mm,
one boy talked about two social workers arriving to see him in school, took him out of the classroom, and he had to go and talk to them about, it was reasonable business. But he said, the interviewer said, what was it like going back into the classroom? He said it
mm,
was horrendous
mm,
because he had to try and explain why was he out of the classroom.
mhm,
Totally under the radar of the social workers involved, who, as far as they were concerned, they were busy people. They had to, um, see him as soon as possible and sort out whatever. But the boy, if you have a more child-centered view, or if you're helped to understand that perspective, you then think, okay, well, how do we actually? It's not that you don't see kids in school. It's not that you don't do certain things, but it's just being a bit more savvy in terms of how to do it in a way that doesn't put the kid into negative space in his peer relationships. Uh, and equally, if you're not in the loop, you're feeling more deflated, more anxious, more resentful, and so on. And it's not they were out of control. Uncertainty, probably one of the great enemies of I think for all of the young people in all the contexts, is when you're in the system, whatever system and for whatever purpose, is the uncertainty. Yeah. So I think a lot of things are tolerable if you have more certainty. Being kept in the loop helps lower uncertainty. Being kept in the loop means giving more time to keeping the young person up to speed with what's happening. In the participation literature, there's a lot of emphasis on formal moments for participation. In other words, there's two issues. One, either that it's about set piece participation, come to this case conference, come to this planning meeting, but then in between there mightn't be much from the kids' point of view participation. So it's a more maybe low-key iterative process that day by day you do, rather than something you sort of have these flashy moments of set pieces where you think, oh yeah, we're a very participation oriented organization. We include children in all our major decision making. But what actually the young person is looking for is something more low-key and kind of natural or organic, rather than these what actually might be quite intimidating set pieces, which are more difficult to actually engage with properly. So depending on, if you have somebody who's very competent, maybe they find that fine, but that's not how certainly in the study we did, that the impression we strongly got was young people valued this more organic, iterative, low-key, day-to-day kind of effort to keep them in the loop. And that's how they saw participation. And I think the lesson of that is, in all our work, and going back to children in care and care leavers, is if we stay in touch with their perspective and know what their concerns are and their thinking is, and we check that out all the time. I know we know that, but in a way we need to be kept reminded of that, because it's difficult to apply it in daily practice given all the other pressures. But if we can get that right, I think a lot of other good things flow from that. That's what I would stress, I think.
I agree. And sadly, one of the little sayings that I trot out largely for shock value, because I am a bit mischievous like that, is whenever you get a group of adults in the room in this sector, the first voice that's lost is the child's voice. I've heard people, when I say that, I heard actually a team that I do supervision with talked about one of their former colleagues who, when they went into these meetings, kind of case conferences for children in care, they would say, "Hand up if you love the children." I've had other conversations, in particular a recent podcast guest, forthcoming podcast interview with a foster carer who puts a photo of the child on the table when there's a case conference. And it is sad that there's it is tough work. And I think when it is in circumstances where it's tough work, we become a bit more inward focused, because we're concerned about our own well-being, and we often have responsibilities for our own children and our own family, and we worry about our capacity to fulfill those responsibilities in circumstances where the job is really quite difficult in some ways, in many ways. But I think what I'm hearing you say is we need to be completely across the experience of the customers of the service, so to speak. I'm not wanting to reduce it in that way, but there is probably lessons
Yeah,
from across other industry areas where customer experience is actually of paramount consideration and of paramount importance. And we would probably say, well, that's a major supermarket chain. That's way less serious than child protection. But
yeah,
isn't it interesting if they are more interested in the customer experience and more adaptive and responsive to the customer experience
yeah,
than what might
yeah.
happen?
And one point I'd like to emphasize in this I think this is a very rich vein of for reflection and discussion for everyone who works in these systems. But I think there's one or two traps. One is to have a consultative group of young people and talk to them about the issues and then think, okay, we've got a fix on that. So we just take their ideas and we'll do what they say, and then everything we'll have that base covered.
Mm,
Uh, that's, I think, a trap because they're not like 100 children or 500 children. I used to say to my students, there's six there's well in the Irish system there's about 6,000 young people in care on any
mhm,
given day, and I said there are 6,000 stories. Just because you've heard one, you haven't heard them all.
mm,
Uh, each story is different, and
mm,
it's our job to hear that story, not think we have one, just a single story. So we can't generalize, research training tells you not to be very careful about generalizing from data. I
mm,
mean, there are certain guiding principles on that, but you're to be cautious about generalizing from a small number of observations, whether that's of individuals or tracking somebody over a short period or whatever.
mm,
Um, now we can learn, definitely we can learn. It's better that we talk to people and listen than not, but we need to be careful that we're just because we've heard certain things from some people that holds true across the board. So that's why if we can find a way of working where we're listening to every child, not just
mm,
uh, episodically a few children, then I think we're going to get more right more of the time.
mhm.
Um, and I think that helps. I think it helps. It also is very powerful, I think, for children to feel they're heard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Therapeutic. Yeah.
even if they don't, I think they begin to see that it's not possible for everything to get to be what they want, but they at least were heard.
They still
Now
have to
they
go to
can become,
school.
yeah, yeah.
Mm,
They can become cynical if they feel there's no change based on anything they've said. So there does need to be some visible
mm,
influence from what they've said. But I think they're pretty sharp cookies, really, and they know that it's not always easy to deliver on everything.
mm,
But if they feel people are making an honest effort and they're being respectful and that they are being listened to, that itself is very therapeutic, I think. They feel, okay, I'm being seen here.
mm,
I think for many young people, the problem is they bring a set of problems or they're landed with a set of problems in their life that they're carrying forward. And then people don't actually add to those problems by not giving them a sense of being heard or a sense of being seen,
mm,
which are very profoundly therapeutic if it's done with genuine and
interest.
authentic commitment
Mm,
and interest. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. It's very interesting conversation. Just take it a little bit in a slightly different direction. Um, Care levers are hard to track, or is that not been your research experience?
Hard to track to deliver
Yeah, hard
services,
to
or
track, hard to keep engaged with.
yeah. Um, well, I think one of the points I think is that we need to think about back to that point about uh, help building a network of resources in the community for each sort of a curated network for each person we're working with, and we may need to conceptualize resources as not just services,
Mm.
but also people or informal resources, sports clubs. Well, sports clubs can be fairly formal places as well,
Mm.
but you know what I mean.
Mm.
In a child protection sense, they may look
Yeah.
informal for the purposes of child protection, but they're very important for lots of
Mm.
reasons, good and bad. Schools, workplaces, work opportunity, work experience, building up those kind of connection. If we build connections for young people, then services maybe fade in importance, and
Mm.
people begin to develop their own trusted connections in their networks and communities. Um, but I think also that where they have, uh, I was talking to somebody last night who, in fact, a conversation between a professional and a care leaver who,
Mm.
uh, they, you know, they knew each other for the first time, I think 10 years ago or something like that. And while they're no longer in a service user helper relationship,
Mm.
they still have some not regular contact, but they bumped into each other through a set of circumstances, and they're meeting for coffee in the next
Mm.
week or so to catch up on all the developments in life. And I think that is lovely when the kind of quality of the relationships people encounter in the service system leads on to some kind of humanity later on in life, and that especially in small communities, I think people are
Mm.
your paths will cross in different ways, and even in bigger suburbs or whatever. But I think it's yes, services. We need services, and particularly the most isolated or marginalized young people would probably need services because their own natural networks will be weakest.
Mm.
Um, but I think the best combo, if you like, in service or policy terms, is some kind of combo that is actively cultivating, curating, nurturing informal resources as well as providing
Yeah.
services.
Mm.
We say one good adult as a sort of a guiding principle, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. But I think there's two concerns. One, I think, is it's a bit based on luck whether you find that good adult. And I think we've got to do policy challenges to reduce the reliance on luck
Mm.
so
Mm.
that we actually have systems which are trying to make sure that we don't need luck.
Mm. Yeah.
It happens
Yeah.
because the processes lead it to lead it in that direction.
Mm.
And services are kind of a minimum safety net for people who don't have other supports. But we should be our aim should be to try and generate an organic network of support, which will include some people with professional know-how, but would be also the grannies, the uncles, the
Mm.
aunts, the neighbors, the sports coach, the former carer.
Mm.
That's very powerful. I think the importance of former carers, and also how I think an important point in care leaving stories is sometimes there's the rupture, there's the care relationship,
Mm.
the care journey, somewhere towards the end of care or early in the transition, there's a row.
Mm.
uh, there was an Irish playwright who said that very often when somebody formed a new organization in Ireland, the first item on the agenda was the split because they'd fall
Yeah.
out. And in a way,
Mm.
that happens a bit in placements or in care settings, that somehow at some point there's a sort of a falling out,
Mm.
and this also happens in ordinary life too, outside the care system to some extent. But I think the point is, if you don't lose faith in the possibility that the life will heal these things very often, not always, but very often. Sometimes the arrival of a baby is
Mm.
a point where everyone sort of sort of gets back in their box and sort of starts being a bit more
mm,
well
mm,
behaved, and the baby bathes everyone
mm,
in goodwill. Um, so I think it's keeping trusting in the potential of these relationships, and even if they're not working well at a particular point, they may come good
mm,
with
mm.
time.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
I often say, sorry, I jumped in. I often say that conflict and ruptures are part of life, and our children need to experience them and get over them, or have that reconnection. Otherwise, the difference is in the care system, these ruptures can go unrepaired. And I think that's really destructive, because then you have an outcome where children learn that conflict will inevitably lead to an unresolved rupture. And that's not good for them. And it's not good for
yeah,
them going forward in their life, and
yeah,
the relationships that they have.
yeah. That's such an important point. Yeah.
Mm,
Uh, and part of our task as adults, I think, is to scaffold young people through these sort of issues, or around these issues, so that we create sort of safe,
mm,
manageable pathways, supported pathways through finding resolutions to conflict,
mm,
uh, and also maybe also learning uh, to let the passage of time to some extent you know he play a part in healing, but and
mm,
a supportive adult acknowledging that there is this conflict, but often these
mm.
it the time just to not lose hope. I think that's an important point, that if they want to restore a relationship that the other person doesn't want to,
Yeah.
or whatever, that just keeping hope alive, I think that's quite an
Mm,
important. And
mm,
also helping people. Very often, young people come into adulthood with gaps of knowledge in terms of connections they have. They don't know their father, or I mean, they may know roughly who their father is, but they don't know a lot about that part of their background.
mm.
So I think there's a lot of good work that can be done within systems to help fill gaps like that. That's done, hopefully while they are in care, but if it isn't, that's, I think, a challenge. Where do young people go for that kind of more profound sort of helping? That I think, insofar as systems are aware of the support needs of care leavers, they tend to be conceived as being, or conceptualized as being, about things like housing. Very, very
Mm,
important. I know that. But
mm.
it's not the only issue. Educational issues, getting the right information about educational opportunities, having the right rules that are flexible enough to cope
Mm.
with the disruptions that care leavers face.
Yeah.
Um, but also the emotional uh, labor, if you like, of being a care leaver is quite considerable. And that's something that came through, interestingly enough, in our Vietnamese study, that
Mm,
how much young people were wrestling with issues
mm.
on their own that were quite demanding emotionally. And I mean, that's not unique to the Vietnamese. It just
No.
happened to be maybe a lens we were looking at what they were saying through. But I think that's, we need to I think about that. How do we create points of access for care leavers where they can get that kind of considered uh, more therapeutic type of support. Not
Mm,
that everyone has to go to therapy forever or anything like that, but just therapeutically informed support
mm.
that's more emotionally oriented at times, I think, is what
Yeah.
people need to process certain kinds of experience, or process certain kinds of gaps that they become aware of in their lives.
Not, you don't have to, um, well, I had a recent guest who said something along the lines of, and I'm trying not to butcher it, but you can be therapeutic an adult can be therapeutic towards a child without being their therapist as such, or
Absolutely.
something a bit like that.
Yeah.
Robbie, I'm aware that we've both got time restraints here. I feel like we're just really getting into the conversation, and that people will reflect a lot on what you've already said during this conversation. But they may well want to know more. You have supplied me, I think, in our communications, the link to that study in Vietnam, which I'll include with the podcast. You also mentioned a book or a book chapter. Is it
Yeah.
a book or a chapter in a book that's coming out
Yes, it
that
is. It's a book. It's a book about social support and residential care. I can send you the details.
I yes, well, and I'll share them with
I'm
whoever
just. I'm sorry to cut across. I'm just a contributor of one chapter, but
I
it's edited
yeah.
by colleagues internationally.
Well, yeah, as I said, thanks again. And maybe I'll get lots of emails asking me to get Robbie Gilligan back on again.
Well, I'd be happy to drop by again.
Maybe I'll do it
Always,
in Ireland next time because
yeah,
I have
absolutely.
an affinity with Ireland. Yeah.
Or I could drop by in Australia
Yeah,
sometime.
or you
I
could
know.
do that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I've quite a few research connections with Australia at the moment, but also
Mm,
friendships with people, Australians or Irish people living in Australia. So
yeah.
my wife and I have been back and forth quite a few times. So it's one of our favorite places. But
Yeah.
it's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm certainly
Yes.
happy to drop by sometime in the future if
Yes.
you're ever
I
in.
I think of Donegal as a second home. So
Oh, very nice.
and I still have a reasonable amount of my work being delivered up there. So yeah.
Very
Anyway,
good.
speak to you another time then.
All right, Colby. Lovely talking to you. Thank you for the invitation. Take
You're
care.
welcome. Thank you.
Bye bye.